Hello everyone, Sebastian here. Welcome to the third part of Panzer Postmortem devlog series. With the project's architecture established and explained in the previous video, it is high time to finally get player involved and talk about the way my game handles input. But talking about input does not just mean talking about keyboards and touchscreens. It also includes separating devices from in-game actions and having a way of representing those actions with entities within the game world. So let's get started. Moving Tank is back with a vengeance, and it is ECS final form, no less. But it's hard to argue that it's not much of a game right now, more of a very repetitive and short film. And quite boring one at that, no matter how interesting underlying architecture might be for maniacs like me. What will turn this little tank from bad movie into exciting game territory is player interactions. Films can be fun, but games offer that extra layer of engagement. It doesn't matter if you are helping Mario to find his princess, controlling Ryu on his way to win Street Fighter tournament, or exploring Azeroth as your alter ego in World of Warcraft. Because of your input, you are taken along for the ride, for the adventure, and not just left to watch from the sidelines. A side note, all those also prove that games are objectively superior to films, just saying. But going back to the topic of the video, let's first think what kind of interactions player will have with Panzer. Main game loop will consist of moving around the map and shooting at the enemy tanks, and there for sure will be some light menu navigation, starting new games, selecting number of players, that sort of things. At this moment, attentive viewers, such as yourself, certainly started suspecting that there might be another language analogy incoming. With how important grammar was for ECS, it's only expected that it will come up again during this series. Well, spoiler alert, you're right, but there is something else I want to talk about first, so put a pin on this and let us carry on for now. Another thing to consider is what input devices the game will support. Keyboard is obvious choice for people playing on a desktop computer, but many people have gamepads too. And what about mobile devices with touchscreens? Game should be playable on those as well. Lastly, the game will have a cooperative multiplayer, so that means any selection from those devices might be active at once. So that's a lot. If you're looking into ways of reading input in MicroStudio, you will get something similar as basically another game engine. So way of more or less directly reading input from selected input device. That is useful, crucial even, because without it, no input from the player could be get at all. But handling all those scenarios of multiple devices with multiple players with nothing but those raw input procedures would become very complex very fast. That's why different approach was designed and is used basically by default in many game dev tools. And that approach is, say, do you remember that language analogy I promised you a while back? Time to deliver on that promise, I guess. All those pin words I have before, moving, shooting, navigating or selecting options, all those are actions. You can think about actions as orders that player can give to your game in a direct way. They hide or abstract away the complexity of physical input device and instead allow to just handle those specific abstract directions. And from the other side, you can have physical input device bind to a specific action. Yes, you guessed it, this is exactly how key binding works. This is all a tad convoluted, so I'll try to explain it differently since finally we have all pieces of the puzzle on the screen. Game does not care about keyboards and gamepads or touchscreens at all. It reacts to specific defined actions. In any game there is a dedicated piece of code that only purpose is to care about input devices and translate those into actions that the rest of the game understands. And in Panzer that piece of code is called Input Manager. Since player input is something that interacts with every element of the game, I created a single global instance of this manager class, same way as with game manager in previous video. This single instance can just hang around and constantly check for changes in all input devices. Any entity or component in the game can just ask a global instance about the current state of any actions it is interested in. Speaking about actions, I gathered all actions that are supposed to be in the game in a single class. Input actions is just a group of binary fields which are perfect to represent a key press. If your game would make use of analog input device, like sticks on the gamepad, then those could be represented by float type with values from -1 up to 1, but for Panzer, simple boolean flags work well enough. During the game, those flags will change values on each frame to reflect current state of player input. Up, down, left and right will be set to true as long as player holds the corresponding key, and when the key is released, they will be set back to false. Fire begin is a bit different, as it will be set to true just for single frame, and then set back to false until the player releases the key and press it again. This might seem unnecessarily complex, but without it the player could just hold fire button throughout the entire game, which would be boring for one, but also not very comfortable. And besides, rapidly spamming fire button is way more fun, I would say. All of this might sound overwhelming, but the actual code is surprisingly simple. From the device side, I just have a variable for each supported device. Each of those variables is a reference to input action object that will hold status of input device. All those variables are updated in the standard update function. Updating keyboard and gamepad states are both very straightforward and are just copied from MicroStudio documentation. Update touchscreen is admittedly more challenging, and that's because I had to deal with the screen coordinates at which the screen was touched. Basically, I check if touch input is inside specific bounds to set the state of particular action. I also made all buttons square on purpose to make the math a bit easier. As is, this code is not yet used by the game itself. For this, I made player controller component. It will control an entity that it is attached to based on player input. It's basically a different version of move component I showed you before. It also stores entity's position, but instead of just changing it automatically, it modifies it based on state it reads from input manager. Easy enough. So that's keyboard done, but what about the gamepad? I could just add another condition to if statement, but then what about the second player? In case of co-op, both devices will be in use at the same time, and the game needs to know what input is for which player. I'm quite sure that players won't find mixing input between their tanks ideal. What I needed was a property in Input Manager that abstracts the device. I want input state of player 1 no matter which input device this particular player is using. Creating property like that is easy enough, but what about values? In Panzer, both players can select whichever controller they want through this user interface. Player 1 can play using keyboard and player 2 can use gamepad or other way around. The moment the choice is confirmed, a function is called that assigns the reference of selected device to player property. And this word here is very important, reference. Since input action is an object, it actually exists in your application on its own. To access it, you need a reference through which you can read values in that object or set some new ones. But nobody ever said you can only have one reference to an object. Each input action has a reference that is used by Input Manager itself to assign state of specific device to the object. When that confirmation method is called, depending on player choice, second reference is assigned to the object. That represents specific player. This way, Input Manager can update state of input actions through device reference, and player controller can read actions state for chosen player. Same as before, implementation is way simpler than the explanation. If player 1 selected keyboard, assign keyboard reference to player 1. If player 1 selected gamepad, assign gamepad reference instead. This way, no matter what device player 1 selected, player controller component will reach correct input action object through the player 1 reference. I'm skipping over the UI implementation here, as it would add a lot of code that don't really impact how Input Manager work. You can check Panzer source code over the MicroStudio website to get the full picture. Input is one of those less glamorous things in game dev. It can be hard to understand and complex to explain, but at the same time is kind of expected by players in every game. Input abstraction system is a requirement for having rebindable keys, which is basic convenience and accessibility feature that all even semi-professional games should have. Thankfully, it's not very difficult to implement, so once you get the hang of it, adding it to the game is not that time consuming. And with that, third part of Panzer Postmodern devlog series is over. Hit a like if you like the video and subscribe because the next video will be about physics and collision detection. Same as always, links to Panzer on MicroStudio websites with full source code and on itch.io are in the description. This was Sebastian and see you in the next video.